All right, it's Thursday, August 27th, and this is the Groups and Simplified Groups and Projects Working Group. So we can start in order, I suppose. I think, Gabe, you're up first.
Yeah, so I think we're getting to the point where Daniel was suggesting that he didn't want to influence, I guess, the prototype too much before we start getting feedback. But I think as part of validating the solution, which we have to have done by the end of September, basically, we need to pretty aggressively show the prototype and gather feedback. Daniel, I know you have a lot of competing priorities, so I'm happy to help take the prototype and record videos of me showing it to people and getting feedback. If also you have a script or questions that you want me to ask, or if you do have the bandwidth to run that, I'm happy. I'd love to just be a fly on the wall and listen as you want to work through that process. But I just want to be intentional about getting as many iterations through based on feedback on the prototype, because I think that's a fine deliverable or thing to show as part of the solution validation. We don't need to do anything super hi-fi. I mean, maybe we do, but the actual working prototype of basically the three things, which would be creating a new object or whatever you want to call it, navigating across between objects, because that's super confusing right now, and then sharing objects with one another and how resources flow between them. So if you were to share a group with another group, would you on that view have options for sharing certain resources like issues and not other resources like merge requests? How do you give the end user more control over what actual resources get shared from one to another? So we can talk, we can do the demo, or you can do the prototype first, but I want to be really intentional about putting together that validation plan, so that we don't lose steam on it in the next few weeks.
Yeah, so right now my workflow or wireframe that I did is really rough, and just I was hoping to see what we could rule out or what doesn't work or what doesn't make sense. So in terms of using that as a guide for end users or testers would be fine. I think it's easier, smarter to rule out what doesn't work than to try and come up with this is the final thing and this is going to work, and without this sort of negative feedback loop or negative feedback from users, just to make sure that we're at least on the right path. So yeah, I mean, insofar as testing, I think it's totally fine to use this. I added the little descriptors at the bottom to try and just have a guide to be more elaborative with the users. Can get rid of that if you want more neutral feedback. But yeah, like I said, or like you said, I do have some other priorities with category maturity right now, so I don't really have the focus or the bandwidth to really make this as nice as it should be in the time frame allotted.
Okay. How do we want to handle that? Because I feel like it to do it well, to get the right UX solution, it will require a lot of bandwidth and time. And I'm not a UX designer necessarily. I can hack on things and I can build Figma prototypes.
Yeah, it's worth chiming in here where I've done a bit of work on the engineering side, and I think that a lot of the work is the UX, UI. It's potentially a lot less engineering than I thought at first.
Yeah, my suggestion might be to open it up to the rest of the UX group and say, hey, is anyone interested in participating or joining on this? We need some more input and some more time and bandwidth from someone else who could do this. I didn't know that I would have the maturity scorecards assigned to me at this quarter, so I kind of jumped in a little early.
Oh yeah, no, I mean you've done great, and I want you to still contribute, but I just am realizing the reality of the situation is it is going to be intensive, and I don't want you to feel burned out you can't ever get to it, or you're juggling all these things. And then but I think it's a great suggestion to open it to the UX group to see if somebody else wants to help drive some of this stuff.
Yeah, I especially want to try and grab people who've been around much longer than I have, because they have a more intricate knowledge of some of the the detail stuff that I might be missing or kind of glossing over. I know like Matei or Tori would have a lot of insight in this, but I know they also have other stuff on their own. But yeah, just, you know, 2 names off the top of my head.
Do you want to reach out since like you know people, or at least like
Yeah.
make the ask? Because I think it
Yeah,
might
for
be
sure.
better coming from you than me.
Yeah, for sure. I'd definitely add that to our UX group channel.
Cool.
See what we can get up with.
And Gabe, what time frame were you thinking you want like the testing and prototyping and all that to happen by? You said like within the next month. Did I hear
Yep.
that correctly? Okay.
Yep. We kind of just had like a exit deadline for the working group. At least the first step of the exit criteria, which we could close the working group after that, was finishing the opportunity canvas for this. That the problem, we basically did the problem, got Scott and a new blessing to do the working group, and then we need to do the solution validation. And then based on like whether we validate the solution or not, we'd have to get their approval and probably SIDS as well to move forward, like actually doing it. But that we kind of set the target date, I think, at the end of September. Isn't that right, Justin?
Yes, that was what we said. So that we can be prepared to go into like Q4 if we want to pitch teams starting to work on the validated solution, because we think it's a cross team, cross stage, cross group effort to do this. And it's not something that like one stage or even one group could prioritize by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So the goal is to get some sort of an OKR from the top down to support this effort. So that everybody works on it.
I've been looking into like the testing process and whatnot for our maturity scorecard work. And it takes like 3 weeks today to recruit people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we want end of September, it's like we should be recruiting right now, probably. Like we should start.
Well, that's where we can recruit people that way, or we can recruit people like the old-fashioned way of saying, "Hey, customer, I've talked with you several times about this pain point. Let me show you this. Can you provide some feedback?" You know, type thing. And I think there's a healthy dose of both. But like basically, I would like to do it that way, and then also do it the formal, like let's do some blind tests, recruit some people that have, you know, no super intimate knowledge of GitLab, and see like how it works with them. We can also consider doing some usertesting.com things where we basically give people some of the jobs that they need to do. They don't know anything about GitLab, and give them the prototype and see if they can complete it. I'm open to however we want to tackle this. If we need to start recruiting today, we should do that. I think that's why I wanted to bring up the whole like UX validation research plan type thing, so that we have time. Yeah,
and that's where I felt like I was not able to support the project because I don't have the bandwidth for that.
Cool. Sounds good. Well, does that answer your question, Melissa?
Yeah, so then it sounds like just working dates backwards, right? Like within a week, we want to have someone identified who's going to be like the UX lead. I'll call it that, right? Like the person from the UX side that's like really driving this, right? And then they will submit a UX request, basically. But it sounds like it needs to be like within a week for us to make the deadline for like the formal research, I'll call it that. And squeeze that in by the end of September. And we'll recruit now without prototypes, right? And sort of work on prototypes in parallel.
Yep. So if you can make that ask today, Daniel, we could even try to get somebody identified today or tomorrow.
Yeah, I was doing it right now.
Cool. And then whoever we can pull them into the working group. And if we can't find anyone, then I guess we're gonna like go old school, and I'll like wireframe some stuff up and maybe pull in my UX designer to see if she wants to collaborate on this, so that like we're doing things the way that we should be at GitLab for UX stuff. Cool. Do you want to go ahead? I think we have time. If you want to go ahead and share your first Figma, and we can provide some feedback on it, or at least see what doesn't work.
Yeah, so let me run through it real quick here. think this is it. No. Let's see. There it is. So the way that I had drawn this wireframe down was just as starting from a 0. So the idea that we would want to have an admin set up an instance. So they would create a new object. They would pick the type of object. And then in this case, we will just say, I'm going to start by creating our code repo. And then just copy the content that we currently have. The functional piece still exists. And I don't think it needs to change much. So now we've saved that. We'll have our repo assigned. Next, we'll want to create a new team. Oops. Sorry. So what is going on here?
I got stuck here too. I think there's something off with the trigger from one of the use the next.
Yeah,
and
I'll have to go back with it. So we'll create a team. It's a team name, and then we assign. We click on the add team members. So again, this is all the same sort of logic we have currently. So now we have our team and our repo. So now let's assume that we've gone ahead and built out the entire organization, but the idea of going back and adding the components you want in your org to share between. So we'll go ahead and go back to the team. We'll choose what objects we want to share. So we want to share the repo and epics and issues, for example. That will attach the headcount or the access to those objects. So now we have a toggle where we have the primary screen or the secondary screen, which are the objects that are associated to it. So now if we're looking at just kind of a flat hierarchy, there's no really nested objects going on here. The connections are direct through this share function. This would be the screen that a dev would see. They wouldn't have any of the additional stuff. They would just strictly have objects they need for their day-to-day tasks. And this needs further investigation. You know, our to-dos, merge requests, are these part of a flat object, or are they part of the repo? So now looking at nested objects and further sharing. And the idea is that we'll look at how a QA team, for example, would work on this. So I'll look at the repo, or excuse me, not QA, a support team. So from here, the support team doesn't necessarily have access to anything, but they exist in tandem. So the repo would actually have the team members underneath it, and the epics and issues would be shared across. And that's sort of where I stopped. I didn't have enough time to get further in detail into this. But like I said, it's really kind of rough. I need to go back and clean up the links that are not clicking right. But yeah, that was just kind of like a first draft, like I said.
I don't want to dominate feedback. Does anyone else have feedback before I go?
One maybe nitpicky thing, but I think the term object is like confusing. That would be something to like test, right, and see if we can.
Gabe had brought that up earlier in the chat, and I agree. I don't like the word object, but I'm also hesitant on calling it team or workspace or lab or anything at this point, because I don't want to say if we call it something that would guide or influence what we want it to do or solutions it could offer. I'm open to changing it or calling it whatever. I just don't want to have any sort of direction or influence on it. So I mean, like namespace or container makes sense.
Maybe it could just say new, right? And with a little button, like arrow, and then when you expand it, it's like it shows you new what.
Yeah, and then also Gabe had feedback in regards to instead of adding separated objects, rather have the container just be a blank container and then attach features via a toggle, which I had thought about earlier. And I think that also makes sense because then you can define a more robust object instead of having to do more direct connections. But I was choosing the separated behavior so that way you could have stronger separation between objects. without the problems of inheritance. But again, all this needs to be tested with users to see if it even makes sense or if the logic works.
The only thing, and I don't know the answer to this, right? I'm just thinking out loud. It's like within a workspace or whatever I end up calling it, would you ever want to have two of one thing, right? I guess that doesn't, if you have toggles, it's just like, can I use it? It's not a one necessarily, right?
Yeah, and the other thing regarding the toggle behaviors, I wasn't certain how you would want to work with nested objects. So when you create the object and you toggle the features you want in the object, would a feature be to add an additional nested object? That's sort of where the idea that I had to kind of separate that so that it was more like nesting was logical.
Yeah, the way that I was thinking about it is you would create your thing, whatever you call it, object now, and then you could toggle which features you wanted there, but then you could you could basically create a new object within that, like sort of, so that way we're not like taking users too far, but it's almost like creating a new subgroup. But what we're doing is just setting up the DAG relationship behind the scenes between the two. So for example, like in that you could create one object, and then you could have two other objects within that. They're both just repos. If that makes sense.
Would you want to do that? Have repos in nesting?
Yes. Well, yes. The use case right now is like why you have to have people want issues at the group level is because they have many repos underneath them, and they want to do their issue management in one place, not in like a project within a subgroup. They just want to do it here, and they want to manage their code down in this tier, right? Or case in point, they want to manage their templates in this thing up here, and they want all their things down here to like automatically inherit those, so they don't have to manually go update a template across 100 different repos, for example.
I wonder if like a good first step, right? Because I know anecdotally you've heard some of this. I've heard some of this, Gabe, about like, oh, like people want to organize things in ways and they can't do it, right? I wonder if maybe just like having a formal inventory, right, of these use cases would be helpful, right? Of just saying, hey, like this is what their org structure looks like. This is what their like tech stack looks like. This is how they would want to like represent things. And then that way it's not so like theoretical, and whoever works on the design has like this test cases basically that they can run designs against.
Have you seen the solution issue that I created?
No.
I'll drop it into this working group. Solution issue. So that's sort of what I did here in this issue. I went through and I basically said like, and I pulled verbatim customer in their own writing use cases. So like needing to track multiple milestones and multiple epics across objects. Basically like pull up a board that has every developer in my team across all my objects, not just top level objects they align with. And so like I kind of put all of those weird use cases about how people want to structure the relationships of things based on their own words. And then there's the other problem, which is more in, I guess, like, you know, we need all these capabilities at the group or project level, and the, you know, duplication of it, deduplication of it. So do we need more than that?
Where did you drop the link?
It's item 6 on the agenda.
Oh, on the agenda. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh no, yeah, this is awesome. I could probably add some stuff here from the like
do.
access perspective.
Please do. That would be great.
With the UI, what you've shown there, Daniel, I guess it's a look at the UI from a fresh perspective. Have you considered what it would look like if you just mashed groups and projects? Like into one?
Yeah, my initial assumption there was just to move everything that was at the project level to the group level and basically remove the concept of a project, because then the idea would be that everything is there available at the level that you would want and there's no functional separation. And then you would just be able to create redundancy or nested objects in the same way. So I didn't think it needed much exploration, but I think there was pushback on that in our last discussion.
So there was nothing that stood out to you, at least
No,
in that sort of short review that sort of would stop that potentially from happening.
Yeah, for me, like the only way that it looked was it just looks like a group with the additional features that exist at project. I didn't see any sort of strange thing that stood out, but perhaps I missed something.
The only thing, and I started doing this and I'll finish doing it this week, was looking at access. In general, the rules are pretty much the same between the two, but there are a couple of outliers where groups, a certain role has certain permissions in a group, but not in the project. So if you were to mash them together, we basically would have to make sure that the permissions between the group and the project were identical, right? So that way, like if you were to have one thing, they would all have the same, like that one permission table would just become one permission table, not two separate ones. So I'll finish the audit of that. I started a spreadsheet and I will post it in our Slack channel whenever I'm done with it later today. But that was the only real concern that I would have. And then of course there's like the UX things of like we'll have to figure out you know how the UX should work in certain things like settings and whatnot, where there are some discrepancies. But other than that, there is no functional difference that I could tell.
So if that works, would we all agree that that's going to be a significantly easier task to sort of get through, where you mush the UI together instead of sort of reinventing a new UI?
That's what it felt like from my initial tinkering with this. And again, the only reason I kind of stepped back from it was the description that we had in our last meeting, where like you're basically mashing all the bad stuff together that we don't want to do. It'd be better and easier to start from a clean slate.
Okay.
Which I don't mind. I think the clean slate would be a fantastic opportunity to give us more room for flexibility and to rethink everything. But then going backwards, you know, just as an argument for MVC's sake, like smushing the two objects together might make the most sense, because then you have the features that people are asking for. I want stuff at the group level, or I want stuff across the organization. But the only pushback that I heard initially was, as you described, putting Band-Aid on a problem, right?
Yep. Okay. So my feedback, because I was fairly strongly pushing against trying to rework with the groups and the projects, but now having looked under the hood and spent some time under there, I'm more optimistic in that direction. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, again, that was my only concern, was just because the way you described it is that it might be problematic. But if you're saying that perhaps it's not so ugly, we just squish them together, like maybe that's the first step, as we can spend more time on this, trying to come up with a new object or a new container or a new proposal, and we can get feedback around that if we do the code smush.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a more logical first step if you could. I'll have better information next week. I'll make sure that I actually try to mush these things together. I can go through my diagram now if you think there's time, but if we're short, then it's not a big deal. Okay.
Mushing together, is that a technical term?
Yeah, 3 years of university for that. All right, so this diagram illustrates our top-down hierarchy, where the G things are groups and the P things are projects. So one important thing to note is that projects terminate the path always. So you can't have anything nested under a project at the moment, which is great for us. So yeah, group 1, group 2, project 1, project 2, project 3, and then so hopefully that comes through okay. This is how I would sort of migrate this hierarchy into what I consider to be like the lab structure or the container structure, whatever we want to call it. Essentially, every group, so I've left sort of the colors and the names intact to sort of try to demonstrate what's moved, what hasn't. So each group gets this hidden kind of project behind it, and each project gets a sort of a hidden group, but together they form the lab or the whatever we want to call it, the workspace. And in doing things this way, we can retain the membership structure and sort of the permission structure. But it gives us that flexibility to mush the UIs together and to, you know, call it something else if we want, but essentially retain all of that functionality. So the idea would be that if you, where are we? So if you somehow manage to navigate to one of these two things, you know, like my project in the URL, it would redirect into rendering this lab view. And same thing for like a group. So they're kind of, we just layer on this facade of a lab where a lab is an actual thing, but it's really just this very thin veneer over a group and a sort of a shadow project or vice versa. But the key thing here is that we kind of still work with the existing structure, which gives me a lot of hope that we can not have too much work on the engineering side, sort of deep in the bowels of the system.
Over time, would we work to remove, I guess, the boxes around G2 and like G1 and G1.p and just have like resources in labs?
Yeah, I reckon. I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. Ideally, you would sort of, yeah. So we have sort of a generic container, a generic name for the sort of the boxes, which are namespaces at the moment. So we try to sort of pull things back to that sort of generic namespace type idea. But I think, you know, the working group sort of goal is quite ambitious, and I think there's going to be several significant steps to get to that end goal. So I think this being the first, I think is it leaves me optimistic. I think it's quite achievable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. And I think that's where like we don't have to have everything solved, but at least saying like this is the first step, and then in the future, like ideal and state, this is where we would be, and we don't have to get into solving that. I think that's where we would want to get other engineers involved, like staff engineers, and have other people help out with some of those things after we get this MVC done. So I think this is awesome. And then I think that's where the only other thing to figure out from a UX standpoint, and Daniel started working on this, was just like the sharing of things, right? So in this new model, if we were using the DAG relationships, instead of like a hierarchy, all you're really doing is saying, you know, lab 2 has a traversal ID to lab 5, basically.
That's right.
The
yeah.
relationship.
That's right. And under the hood, it's all sort of somehow magically handled through this group. So when we're saying, oh, these two labs are related, whether we've created this hidden sort of group or it's something that somebody had previously created, for example, it all sort of magically just works as one. But under the hood, it's actually just infrastructure that we already have.
Cool.
It's very clever. Good
Like
work.
it.
We're at time. Alex, do you mind screenshotting that and dropping it in an issue?
Yeah,
or
sure.
or something.
Sure.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone. Daniel, we'll keep an eye on that thread that you dropped in the UX channel, and hopefully can find someone in the next few days.
Yep.
So,
Yep. Thanks,
alrighty.
y'all.
Take
Thanks,
care,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.